The sky was still dark when I locked the door to my little antique restoration shop in Ash Hollow, Colorado. The cold air smelled faintly of snow, and my breath hung in the air as I walked to the truck. 9 hours of road stretched ahead, but I didn't feel tired, just restless. On the passenger seat sat a cedar box wrapped in my grandmother's quilt, the same quilt she used to drape over our laps during winter evenings. Inside that box were 3 hand-drawn navigational charts from my grandfather's 1930s expedition, mapping high desert passes most people didn't even know existed. Each chart was drawn in pencil and ink, the edges frayed from decades of handling. When my son Caleb was little, he would sit cross-legged on the kitchen floor, tracing those faded lines with his fingertip. He called them treasure, and I told him they were history. Back then, he begged for the stories about the desert nights, the hidden waterholes, the ridge where my grandfather once camped for 3 days to avoid a flash flood. I hadn't seen Caleb in 4 months. The last time we spoke, his voice was rushed. He mentioned the engagement dinner would be just family, and I took that to mean me. It never occurred to me that my presence could be optional. As I drove, the world shifted from black to steel gray. The highway wound through canyons, then opened into flat stretches of scrub and rock. Clouds stacked heavy over the horizon. My hand stayed light on the wheel, but my thoughts kept circling back to Caleb's face when I'd hand him the box. Red Hollow was newer than I remembered. Rows of sharp-edged houses with wide, empty driveways. I turned onto a street, my chest tightening with each house number I passed. The cedar box felt heavier when I lifted it from the seat, but I told myself it was only the weight of the wood and paper. This was a gift for a milestone, a bridge between past and future. I believed I was carrying something precious into my son's life. I didn't know yet that before the day ended, it would become the first piece of evidence in a fight I never saw coming. I climbed the short path to Caleb's front porch, the cedar box balanced in my arms. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of voices inside. I pressed the doorbell and heard it echo. After a moment, the door opened, and there stood Sierra. She looked surprised. Not the warm, "Come in, you made it," kind of surprised, but startled, like she'd just seen a shadow she didn't expect. Her smile flickered on and off in the span of a breath. "Elaine," she said, her tone flattened but polite. "I didn't know you were coming." I shifted the box in my arms. "I brought something for the engagement dinner. Thought I'd get here early to help." Her head tilted slightly, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Oh, the dinner was yesterday." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "Yesterday?" She nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It was last minute. My parents and sisters were in town. We figured it made sense to do it while everyone was already here." She shrugged lightly. "We didn't think you'd want to make the drive. It's a lot for one night." Behind her, I could hear laughter and the clink of glassware, distant, muffled, like it belonged to a world I wasn't part of. "I'm here now," I said softly. "Maybe I could just come in for a few minutes. See Caleb? Give him this?" She glanced over her shoulder, then back at me. "It's kind of chaotic right now. Still cleaning up. Maybe another time would be better." There was a pause, the kind that leaves no room for negotiation. I stood there long enough to feel the cold seeping through my jacket. The cedar box seemed to grow heavier, pressing into my ribs. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. She gave a small, tight smile and stepped back just enough to close the door. No hug. No, "I'll let him know you stopped by." Just the click of the latch sliding into place. I stood on the porch for another minute, staring at the grain in the wood, listening to the faint hum of voices inside. Then I turned, walked back to my truck, and set the box carefully on the passenger seat. I stayed parked at the curb for almost an hour, waiting for the sound of footsteps or a knock on my window. Nothing came. No call. No text. Not even a message from Caleb. The box sat there beside me, a silent witness. I remembered his small hands tracing those lines, calling them treasure. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, telling myself to drive before the weight of that memory pinned me in place. The drive home felt longer than the one that had carried me to Red Hollow. The road stretched out like a strip of gray ribbon, each mile pulling me further from the moment I thought I was going to have, and deeper into the one I'd been handed instead. By the time I parked in front of my small brick house, the clouds had sunk low, heavy enough to make the street lamps flicker on early. Inside, the silence wrapped around me, not the comforting kind, but the sort that presses on your ears. I carried the cedar box straight to the back room, slid open the bottom drawer of the old oak cabinet, and placed it inside. On top of it, I set my father's brass compass, the one he used when he taught me to navigate by landmarks instead of maps. The drawer had always been where I kept things that mattered, things you didn't just hand over lightly. That's when I saw it. An envelope tucked between two stacks of old restoration invoices. I recognized the letterhead before I even picked it up. High Desert Heritage Museum, a place I'd worked with years ago when they were cataloging a collection of pioneer tools. The envelope had been sitting there for weeks, maybe months. I slid my finger under the seal and unfolded the letter. It was from Helen Monroe, the museum's director. Her tone was warm, almost personal. She'd heard that I was still in possession of several rare historical artifacts, and she wondered if I might consider allowing them to be displayed in a new exhibition on early desert trade routes. I remembered when they'd first approached me years ago. I'd said no. Back then, the charts were for Caleb someday, part of his inheritance, part of his story. I read the letter again, and then a third time. The house was still cold, but something inside me had shifted. The ache in my chest from standing on Caleb's porch wasn't gone, but it had stopped being just hurt. It was becoming clarity. Helen had written, "Our goal is not to take these pieces from you, but to ensure they live in a space where their story can be told and preserved." For the first time in hours, my breath didn't feel caught halfway in my throat. I reached for the phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the page. Helen answered on the second ring, surprised to hear my voice, but her warmth filled the silence between us. "I think I'm ready," I said. "The maps deserve a place where they're seen." And though I didn't say it out loud, what I meant was, someplace where they can't be shut behind a closed door. The morning after my call with Helen, I decided to start gathering whatever documents I'd need for the museum. I pulled out the maps from the drawer and set them gently on the kitchen table, then walked to the hallway closet where my safe sat wedged behind an old sewing machine. The safe wasn't fancy, steel with a dial lock I'd had since the early 90s, but it had always been enough for me. My fingers turned the combination by memory, the metal giving that soft click when it reached the right place. Inside were the things I didn't touch often. My birth certificate, the deed to my house, a bundle of letters from my mother tied with a blue ribbon. At the bottom sat a slim manila folder labeled Sagebrush Cabin. The cabin had been my refuge. I bought it with my own savings after the divorce, when the weight of silence in my empty house had become too much. It was the one place where I never felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I pulled the folder out, expecting to see the original title and property tax receipts. They were there, but so was something else, a set of crisp, stapled documents that didn't belong. Across the top, in bold, it read, "Transfer of Title." My eyes caught the name, CVH Land Holdings LLC. Under manager was Caleb Porter. Under registered agent was Sierra Vaughn. The signature block where mine should have been was filled with a looping scrawl that looked nothing like my handwriting. A notary stamp sat beside it, bearing a name I had never seen before. I flipped the page, my heartbeat picking up speed. The next sheet was worse. A collateral agreement naming the Sagebrush Cabin as security for a short-term loan. The purpose? Investment capital for a vineyard in southern Utah. I had never heard of the vineyard, never signed a single paper agreeing to this. The edges of my vision tightened. My hands were cold, but my palms were damp against the paper. This wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate. I placed the documents back into the folder with slow, deliberate care, then set the folder inside a black leather briefcase I kept for appraisal visits. I locked it, snapped the clasps shut, and carried it to my bedroom. For a long time, I sat on the edge of the bed, the briefcase at my feet, staring at the wall. The museum could wait. The maps could wait. Whatever Caleb and Sierra had done, they'd done it quietly, confident I wouldn't notice. They were wrong. By morning, the briefcase might as well have been a living thing, humming with the weight of what it held. I couldn't leave it in the house another day without knowing exactly what I was up against. The nearest town with a reputable law office was Silverford, 40 minutes away over winding roads. I called ahead, asking for an appointment with Margaret Kane, a name I remembered from years back when she'd handled an estate dispute for a friend of mine. The receptionist hesitated when I said I didn't want to share details over the phone, but booked me in for early afternoon. Margaret's office was in an old brick building near the courthouse. She greeted me with a firm handshake, sharp gray eyes taking in everything without judgment. Once the door to her office closed, she gestured for me to start. I told her about the drive to Red Hollow, about standing on my son's porch with the cedar box in my arms, about the door closing in my face. I told her about opening my safe, finding the folder, and reading the transfer of title to CVH Landholdings, LLC. She asked for the documents, and I slid them across the desk. Margaret read in silence, flipping each page carefully, once, then again. She didn't interrupt, but I saw her jaw tighten slightly when she reached the notary stamp. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Elaine, what you are describing is more than a misunderstanding. This is fraudulent conveyance. And that signature isn't just suspicious. It's a problem for them if we can prove it's forged." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. She explained the next steps. Investigate the LLC, when it was formed, by whom, and with what filings. Search for any recent legal documents in my name, powers of attorney, amendments to my will, anything that could have been signed without my knowledge. Confirm whether the cabin's deed transfer was filed with full legal consent. She advised me not to contact Caleb or Sierra, not even hint at what I'd found. If they realize you're moving against them, they'll cover their tracks, she said. I nodded, but inside a storm was already gathering. My mind kept flashing back to the years I'd stepped in for Caleb, when he needed help with his first down payment, when his business deal fell apart, when he couldn't make property tax. I never asked for a contract. I trusted my son. Now that trust sat across the desk from me in black and white, stripped of sentiment, redefined as evidence. 2 days after my meeting with Margaret, I drove to the sagebrush cabin. I told myself it was to take photos for the case, but that wasn't the whole truth. I needed to see it, to touch the walls and floors before someone else claimed them as theirs. The dirt road wound upward through tall pines, the scent of sap and cold earth drifting in through my half-open window. When the cabin came into view, my chest tightened. Weathered wood siding, green shutters I had painted myself one summer, and a porch that creaked under my boots just like it had the day I bought it. Inside, the air was cool and still. I opened the curtains, letting the light spill across the knotty pine walls. Every detail was a memory. The chair in the corner where I used to read on rainy afternoons, the stone hearth I built with my own hands. I lit a fire, more out of ritual than necessity, and sat there until the tension in my shoulders began to ease. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe the cabin was still mine in every way that mattered. 2 mornings later, back in Ash Hollow, there was a knock at my door. On the porch stood Vivian Rowe, a family friend, and my late aunt's closest companion. She looked smaller than I remembered, her silver hair pinned neatly, eyes sharp as ever. "I heard about some trouble," she said without preamble. "With the cabin." I didn't ask how she knew. In small towns, certain news travels faster than you think. Vivian reached into her coat and pulled out a thick envelope, yellowed at the edges. "Your mother gave me this before she passed. She told me to hold it until I thought the time was right. I think that's now." Inside was a stack of legal documents, along with a handwritten note in my mother's looping script. The papers showed that years ago, she had placed the cabin into a private trust in my name only. Airtight, irrevocable. My hands shook as I read. If these documents were legitimate, CVH Landholdings never had a legal claim. Caleb and Sierra's transfer was built on nothing but forged ink and lies. I looked up at Vivian. She nodded once, as if to say, "You know what you have to do." Then she stepped back into the cold and left me standing in the doorway, the envelope clutched against my chest. The call came 3 days later. Caleb's voice was careful, almost rehearsed. "Mom, Sierra and I were hoping you'd come over for dinner. We should talk." I could hear the hesitation, the way he swallowed between words. I agreed, not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted to see their faces when the truth landed. Their house looked the same as the day I'd been turned away. Trimmed hedges, spotless driveway, but the air felt different when Sierra opened the door. Her smile was polished, like she was greeting a client. Caleb hovered behind her, hands in his pockets. At the table, they talked about the weather, about Sierra's work, about moving forward as a family. I let them talk, nodding when appropriate, sipping my water. When the plates were cleared, I reached into my bag and set a thin envelope in the center of the table. Caleb's brow furrowed as he picked it up. Sierra leaned closer, curiosity tightening her jaw. Inside was a certified copy of the legal freeze order Margaret had filed that morning, an immediate suspension of all transactions involving CVH Land Holdings LLC, pending investigation into fraudulent property transfer. Caleb's face drained of color. "What is this?" "It's the beginning of the end," I said quietly. Sierra's eyes flickered, but her voice was sharp. "You're overreacting. This is all still in the family. You'll benefit—" I cut her off. "No. You took what wasn't yours. You forged my signature. You used the one place I built for myself as collateral for a gamble I never agreed to." I let the silence stretch, watching them shift in their seats. Then I laid it out, my voice steady. "As of today, you are removed from every account, every legal document, every inheritance. You have 60 days to vacate the house you're living in. My house." After that, the locks change. Caleb stared at the table, shoulders hunched. Sierra's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not doing this out of spite," I said, standing. "I'm doing it to protect what's mine." I walked to the door without waiting for a reply. No one followed me out. The night air was cool against my face, and for the first time in months, my hands weren't shaking. The 60 days moved quickly, but I didn't waste them watching boxes pile up by their door. Margaret's calls came steadily, updates, filings, confirmations. By the time the deadline drew near, the court had dissolved CVH Land Holdings LLC and restored full ownership of the sagebrush cabin to me. It should have felt like the final chapter. Instead, it felt like the prologue to something else. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the cabin deed in one hand and my mother's trust papers in the other. My eyes drifted to a note I'd scribbled weeks ago. "Protect the ones who still have a chance." It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about the way women like me, women over 50, could be erased by the very people they'd built their lives around. I started making calls. To Margaret, to Helen at the museum, to an old friend who ran the town's community center. Within 2 months, the Porter Legacy Project took shape. Legal clinics, financial literacy workshops, and a safe space for older women to reclaim their independence. The first workshop was on a rainy Saturday in March. 6 women came, coats dripping, eyes tired. One clutched a grocery bag filled with unopened bills. Another sat down and began to cry before we'd even started. I didn't stand behind a podium. I sat with them at the same table, shared coffee, and told them part of my story. Not all of it, just enough for them to know I wasn't above them. I was beside them. A local paper caught wind of the project and sent a columnist to sit quietly in the corner. The article ran a week later, tucked between obituaries and sports scores, but it lit a spark. Soon after, I got a call from a program director at the regional PBS affiliate, inviting me to speak at their annual Women's Legacy Night. I hesitated. A stage wasn't where I'd ever pictured myself. But when I thought of the women who had shown up that rainy morning, I said yes. Standing under the theater lights, I told them about the cabin, about the silence after my husband died, about the day I realized my own son no longer saw me as a mother, but as an obstacle. But more than that, I told them about what happened after, the rebuilding, the women, the ripple effect. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was steady and it reached me in a way that words never could. A week after the PBS event, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. Caleb's handwriting. The note inside was short, almost cold, asking me not to speak about family matters in public again. I read it once, then set it aside without replying. The Porter Legacy Project was growing faster than I'd imagined. Each week, new women came through the doors. Teachers, nurses, grandmothers, each carrying a different story of being cut out, pushed aside, or taken advantage of by the people they had trusted most. They arrived weary. But more often than not, they left standing a little taller. One crisp autumn morning, I drove out to the cemetery with a single sunflower from the garden behind the center. I placed it at my mother's grave and stood there until the wind picked up. The grief I'd carried for years felt lighter. I realized I'd been holding on to more than loss. I'd been holding on to silence. The cabin's deed now sat secure in my safe, but it no longer felt like the heart of my victory. The real triumph was the life I had taken back. I had learned to set boundaries without apology, to stand guard over what mattered, and to pass that knowledge to others who needed it. Love does not excuse dishonor. Legacy is not something you lock away in a vault or write into a will. It's the strength you protect in yourself and the courage you give to others. One afternoon, sunlight streamed into my kitchen, landing on the cedar box I'd once carried to Caleb's porch. Inside, the maps were now secured in a custom display case, ready for the museum to collect. I ran my hand over the smooth wood, feeling the warmth of the sun and the steady beat of my own heart. I closed the lid, not with the ache of loss, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had stepped back into her own story. The fight was over. The peace was mine. And this time, I didn't need anyone's permission to keep it.